President Trump shifted his tone this week, casting doubt on the prospect of a summit between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Trump's frustration appears to be mounting, warning that the next 2 weeks could be pivotal if there's no progress towards a peace deal. Trump says he could weigh massive sanctions or massive tariffs, or both, or as he put it, do nothing and say it's their fight. CGTN's Jim Spellman has more in this report.
After 3.5 years of fighting, the conflict in Ukraine continues with no end in sight. On the battlefield, Russia controls much of the Donbas region in the east and smaller pockets of key strategic areas in the northeast, plus Crimea. Ukraine controls a smaller area inside Russia in the Kursk region. Fighting has been intense throughout the summer, including drone strikes. Earlier this month, U.S. President Donald Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, and then with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and European leaders in Washington. But the talks yielded no breakthroughs, and there's no indication a ceasefire is imminent. Trump says Zelenskyy and Putin must meet one-on-one.
Well, that's going to be up to them. It takes two to tango, I always say it. And they should meet, I think, before I have a meeting and probably close the deal.
But no meeting is currently planned. Reports say Moscow is demanding that Ukraine give up land controlled by Russian troops.
Yes, that is one of its results. Territorial changes are often an essential component of conflict resolution. There are many such examples.
Zelenskyy has rejected giving up territory, at least for now. Security guarantees for Ukraine have emerged as a key issue, and European countries are willing to deploy troops. Moscow is open to non-aligned countries providing security, but rejects Western troops and wants assurances Ukraine won't join NATO.
The majority of these countries are NATO members. In fact, at the very beginning, it was the advancement of NATO military infrastructure and the infiltration of this military infrastructure into Ukraine that could probably be named among the root causes of the conflict situation that arose. So we have a negative attitude towards these discussions.
Ukraine refuses to rule out joining NATO or giving up its ability to form alliances with any country it chooses. Trump's envoy met with Zelenskyy earlier this week.
We're hoping to get to a position where in the near term we have, for lack of a better term, security guarantees. That's a work in progress.
With peace talks at an impasse, Zelenskyy is calling for more sanctions against Russia.
Russia is giving signals, only that it is going to continue to evade real negotiations. This can only be changed by strong sanctions, strong tariffs, real pressure.
President Trump says he is weighing more sanctions against Moscow, which could include so-called secondary sanctions against Russia's trading partners. But he says there will be no U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. Jim Spellman, CGTN, Washington.
Okay, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Anton Fedyashin is a Russian and European affairs analyst and history professor at American University. Dmitry Babich is a Russian journalist and political analyst. Also with us is William Lawrence. He's a political science and international affairs professor at American University. And Peter Zalmayev is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Peter, the talks are now stalled, the peace talks. President Trump is now, as I said, changing his tone, doubting whether President Zelenskyy and President Putin will meet anytime soon. And then we also had news over the past few days that Russia has made a major gain into an industrial part of Ukraine. So what is your assessment? What is it going to take to undo this logjam?
Well, I think that my assessment remains the same. I don't think that Vladimir Putin genuinely went into his talks in Alaska expecting to have any one-on-one or a trilateral with Zelenskyy and Trump. I think that they played a trick on the highly manipulable American president. They made vague sounds about that possibility, including when Steve Witkoff went to Moscow and met with Putin for the umpteenth time. But they never really meant it. Putin got all the optics out of that meeting, the red carpet, etc., but he never really wanted to meet with Zelenskyy once again. He does not consider Zelenskyy a legitimate president. Yeah. So that would be really difficult to explain to his elites why he would be meeting with him now. And of course, as you mentioned, yes, there have been gains. Putin wants to knock out somewhere Ukrainian territory before his ready to sit down and talk. I'm not sure when that moment is coming, but we're not, I don't think, anywhere near it at this point.
Peter, the U.S. Vice President, J.D. Vance, he was asked recently about the peace talks. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
I think the Russians have made significant concessions to President Trump for the first time in 3.5 years of this conflict. They've actually been willing to be flexible on some of their core demands. They've talked about what would be necessary to end the war. Of course, they haven't been completely there yet, or the war would be over, but we're engaging in this diplomatic process in good faith. We are trying to negotiate as much as we can with both the Russians and the Ukrainians to find a middle ground to stop the killing.
So, Peter, what do you make of those comments, especially J.D. Vance saying that Russia had made significant concessions?
Well, show me the money, as they say. I haven't seen the evidence. Of course, J.D. Vance is a loyal team player of the Trump administration. From the beginning, he's been a skeptic of continued aid to Ukraine. And so what we're hearing is, talk about significant concessions, but what exactly are they? The only one I've been able to ascertain is the concession is that Russia pledges not to destroy or occupy all of Ukraine, which of course is a non-starter. I mean, this is not serious talk. So, I mean, in the absence of any concrete figures, proposals, I think it's a moot point to be even discussing this.
Dmitry Babich, over the weekend, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, he said President Putin cannot sign any kind of peace agreement with President Zelenskyy because Moscow considers Zelenskyy illegitimate. It was a point that Peter made a moment ago. And when asked about it, President Trump, he used a term, well, he said BS. So where does this leave the peace talks if Russia thinks that it doesn't have someone it could negotiate with?
Well, before that, our foreign minister said that, I quote, "We recognize Zelenskyy as the head of the regime."
Yeah.
So there were, I would say, conflicting messages from Moscow, and I think it's understandable why they're conflicting, why there are conflicting messages, because indeed Mr. Zelenskyy leaves a lot of reasons not to trust him. Look at the recent conflict between Mr. Zelenskyy and Hungary. Hungary protested together with Slovakia against the destruction of the oil pipeline, Friendship, it's called Druzhba. The Ukrainian drones and missiles 3 times attacked this pipeline and left Eastern Europe without oil for 5 days. And Zelenskyy did not even apologize. So when something similar happened in 2009, and because Ukraine refused to pay its debts, Eastern Europe was left without oil and gas. Let me remind you of that. There was a scandal all over Europe. Russia was blamed by everyone for a year after that. And now Mr. Zelenskyy does it, and there are no protests from the EU or from the United States. There was just a brief letter of Mr. Trump to Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, saying that I understand your situation. So indeed, Mr. Zelenskyy is a difficult partner. He is supported by the EU leaders, but he changed his position many times. So we have heard a lot about distrust of the West in Putin, but there are reasons why Russia can distrust Zelenskyy.
William Lawrence, the battles are raging on. As I said a moment ago, Russia made a significant advance just a few days ago. President Trump says that if there is no progress towards a peace deal, then he will impose more sanctions on Russia or impose more tariffs on Russia, or both, or do nothing at all. How do you see this playing out?
Well, first of all, the Russians have proven they're resilient against any sanctions, and any talk of new sanctions and secondary sanctions and tariffs, I think, will not have a big direct effect on Putin. I also believe that, however, if there are significant sanctions, secondary sanctions, tariffs on countries like India, that could create some discord. But even India has seemed to throw in its lot with the Russians, and has recently been dialoguing with China as well, and there's a rapprochement going on there. So India's gamed this out and figured, they can live without the United States to some degree for a certain period of time because of their, they do better within that Russian-China set of countries. And so I'm not sure that what Trump is saying has as much effect as he thinks it does. That said, everything matters, and the direction it's going in matters. And I would say that the main game in Washington, in my opinion, is simply, will the U.S. continue to support Ukraine at the level it needs to be supported to continue to resist the new Russian onslaught? And so far, so good. But however these negotiations go and these threats go could impact whatever the next aid package is for Ukraine and the sustaining U.S. provision of arms, although Zelenskyy and the Europeans have come up with a brilliant maneuver around that by offering to buy all of these weapons from the United States.
Right.
And so, I think that none of these moves are enough. What it's really going to take in the end is the calculation that Ukraine needs to be doing better militarily in order to have a better bargaining position.
Just very quickly, William, one of the threats coming from President Trump is that the United States will do nothing.
Yeah.
Is that really an option for the United States, do nothing?
Well, do nothing in the sense of take no for more actions. I mean, the U.S. continues to support Ukraine with intelligence, with weapons. It continues to coordinate, at the lower levels in government with all kinds of people that deal with this conflict in many different ways, and that'll continue. But when Trump says do nothing, he means that he would do nothing, and he would do nothing new. And I think this comes from his own self-centered approach to and personalized approach to affairs. And so if he just does nothing, then he feels somehow everybody suffers. I think that's a wrong calculation, but that's sort of how Trump views the world.
Right. Anton, the issue of security guarantees, that's been discussed at length. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia, he alluded to draft principles which were presented by Ukraine in April of 2022 that were actually initialed by both sides at that time. Let's listen to some of that.
Those principles proposed by Ukrainian delegation, I underline this once again, they provided for creation a group of guarantors. This group containing of permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, US, China, UK, and France. Plus, they mentioned Germany, Turkey, and any other country which would be interested to join this group of guarantors. And guarantors would be guaranteeing the security of Ukraine, which must be neutral, which must be non-aligned with any military bloc, and which must be non-nuclear.
So, Anton, that agreement was never formally approved by both sides. That was after Boris Johnson threatened Ukraine with withdrawal of support if it signed that deal. But could it be the basis for a new deal?
It sure can, and that's what the Russians are pushing. Although it's interesting to reflect on the fact that back in 2022, when the Ukrainians were essentially told to walk away from this agreement, we have confirmation of this from Ukrainian politicians, from Victoria Nuland, from Boris Johnson. He's the only one who refuses to acknowledge that he played a role in this. But we know this from many politicians. Back then, for some reason, security guarantees were the condition for the West walking away from supporting Ukraine. Now, the West's position has turned around 180 degrees. It requires security guarantees. The Russians look like they're going to be going back to Istanbul, and they're approaching the negotiations that they're trying to kickstart with Ukraine, except not between the presidents, but between teams working on specific issues, including borders. They are approaching these as Istanbul Plus, and they've said so on many occasions. And the trap here, and this is what's very difficult for the Ukrainians and for the West, especially the Europeans, is that without the Russians being brought into these guarantees, bilateral guarantees for Ukraine by Western countries simply do not matter. And we know that for a fact because, as I mentioned on a previous show, let me repeat this because it's important. Ukraine has bilateral security agreements with 25 Western states, all 7 of the G7 members, including the United States. It was signed on the 13th of June of 2024 under President Biden. Ukraine has a 100-year agreement with Great Britain. None of that matters today because here we are cycling back to security guarantee talk. And the major part of the reason why all of those bilateral security guarantees don't matter is that everything depends on what the Russians do.
Right.
And that makes it impossible to settle this without security guarantees being given to Russia at the same time as they are being given by everyone, including the Russians, to Ukraine.
But listening there, Anton, to Sergei Lavrov, is he talking about a Security Council resolution which will ensure security for Ukraine and will guarantee peace? Because the Europeans are talking about deploying their own troops in Ukraine.
Yes, that's right. And it sounds like that's what the Russians will start moving towards. If all the Security Council members guarantee security, then by default, this will easily pass through the Security Council. I don't see anyone disagreeing with in the Russian camp or in the American camp. So I think the resolution is actually less important than the actual agreement that everyone's security interests are taken into account. But it sounds like we're a while from there right now.
All right, Peter Zalmayev, what are your thoughts on that proposal by Lavrov?
Well, I think, Mr. Lavrov has, in the eyes of Ukrainians, has very little credibility as someone who, from the get-go, claimed, as you remember, in the peace talks in Istanbul early on in the first 2 months of war, that Russia never invaded Ukraine in the first place. So it seems to be that he's hiding behind all this nice diplomatic language, but there's very little substance. I think Mr. Lavrov is, once again, a loyalist. He toes the party line. And he's been giving instructions to basically broadcast, to the world that Russia will, as they say, fulfill all of its, the goals of the so-called special military operation. And whatever is being done now is just enough to sort of, drag the U.S. along to keep Donald Trump from making, unfavorable decisions when it comes to possible new sanctions, etc. But I think this is, once again, this is playing for time. I'm not seeing any signs that Russians have been willing to compromise on any of their maximalist demands.
Do you see any common ground, Peter, on the territorial issue, on territorial concessions? Because Lavrov has also said that Russia is not intent on occupying these territories permanently, but he wanted security for Russian speakers in the East. He said, in fact, the term he used was "let people go."
Well, you remember after the takeover of the Crimea, first of all, the Russians claimed they were not there. It was some green men.
Yeah.
And they claimed that they didn't want any more of Ukraine's land. So that just goes to show how much they're to be trusted on that. I think common ground can be found on a tactical level. If Putin needs a break and he decides to settle for a ceasefire for now, maybe. But I don't think this, once again, his goal remains the same. He wants all of Ukraine's control over all of Ukraine.
Right.
He wants political control in Kyiv, and everything else is just basically window dressing.
Dmitry, would Russia be prepared to compromise on the territory issue in return for solid security guarantees for the Russian speakers in the east of Ukraine, perhaps something that is sanctified by a United Nations Security Council resolution?
I think Russia would like to compromise, and it tried to do it many times before. But for it to be successful, I think the nature of the regime in Kiev should change. Because what happened in 2014? Let's remember the whole story. The legally elected president was ousted violently in Kiev. He fled to Russia, saving his life. After that, the problem of Crimea became more acute. Russia never demanded Crimea before. The Western press wrote a lot about Russian speakers protesting in Crimea against Ukrainization of their land. So Crimea became Russian. However, Russia supported the Minsk agreements, which presupposed, read the text, that Ukraine would lift the blockade of Donetsk and Lugansk. It would stop military activity there. That didn't happen, even though Minsk agreements presupposed that Lugansk and Donetsk would remain Ukrainian territory with autonomy, with autonomous rights. the word autonomy was not used, but there was a lot of, there was several points about local militia and everything. Ukraine just ignored all of it. The war continued for 8 more years, and then we had this so-called special military operation. So if you look at the way things developed, Russia reacted to the actions of the Kyiv regime and of the West in general. And of course, yes, it's true, Russian position became more severe because with every new step, with every new disappointment with the West, Russia hardened its position.
Yeah.
Now we're trying to return to the situation of April 2022, and we are told that this was wrong, that basically Ukraine can win this war, that Russia should have a defeat inflicted on it. So basically, I don't think that Russia will agree to anything less than a change of the nature of the regime.
All right, let me.
Personalities.
Right. Okay. Let me go to William Lawrence on this. William, Lavrov did say that Russia is prepared and supports the United Kingdom, France, and Germany developing what he calls security guarantees, provided that they are truly reliable. That's what he said. And Putin told Trump that he is prepared to end the war if Ukraine handed over territory. The EU foreign policy chief warned that the Russian demand is, quote, a trap. Her name's Kaya Kallas. She pointed out that Russia has not made any concessions at all. How do you see it?
I don't think these aren't concessions at all, except in the sense that they haven't been made yet. But certainly some of the language that Putin has used has been concessionary language without giving anything up. And, to be honest, everyone's decrying the other side's maximalist positions. But there have been concessionary statements made by Ukraine, too. It's just that you don't have a deal until you have a deal, and then that's when the concessions are concretized. But I have to say that, listening to your previous speaker, this idea that somehow, Russia is the victim and anything Russia did is justified by whatever Ukraine and the West did, I really truly believe is a specious argument. I'm reminded of the old adage, 2 wrongs didn't make a right, and whatever Ukraine did wrong doesn't justify Russia demanding that the regime in Kyiv be changed, that the nature of the regime be changed, or that Russia gets to decide who rules it. Ukraine doesn't want to be Belarus, and they have examples right next door of what they don't want. And so that we need much larger real concessions offered by the Russians.
Okay, I want to get a very quick response to what you're saying from Dmitry. Dmitry, go ahead. If you could keep it brief, please.
The West keeps talking about regime change in Russia, and it started talking about it long before the war in Ukraine started in 2014, and it continued to talk about it for all of these years. So I think everyone should stop talking about regime change. But in the current situation, certainly the nature of our dialogue, if we call it dialogue, which is now bullets and missiles, the nature of the dialogue should change. I think here we can all agree.
Yeah, Anton, how big a division is there, or how deep is that division between what European countries think about how this war should end and how President Donald Trump thinks it should end?
Oh, I think there's a very big division there. And it exists on multiple levels. First of all, the Europeans are staunchly behind Ukraine. But there's something that underlies that, which is a much deeper and systemic European fear that the United States will complete its pivot to Asia and withdraw from Europe. Unfortunately for Ukraine, this translates into the Europeans supporting the maximalist position in Kyiv rather than encouraging Kyiv to move to concede some things, but then at the same time demand the Russians to do the same. For Donald Trump, I think he's written this war off. He's extricating the United States from it because he understands, like most military experts do, that there's absolutely no chance for Ukraine to win this on the battlefield, which we see every day. So the question is how to settle this as quickly as possible. But of course, for Donald Trump, it's Donald Trump. And I agree with what William said earlier. Donald Trump is always at the center of the world for Donald Trump. For him, it's the Nobel Peace Prize that is at the top of his concerns. And by the way, 2025 is exactly 120 years. We're in August right now. It's 120 years since Teddy Roosevelt negotiated the peace between Japan and Russia in 1905. In Portsmouth, by the way, New Hampshire. And for that, he got a Nobel Peace Prize. And I wonder if Donald Trump, if he even knows about the date and the association, is gunning for another one.
Peter, I've just got a minute left. What kind of domestic pressure is President Zelenskyy under right now during these negotiations? You know, last week we had the former right sector leader, Sergei Stenenko. He warned that giving away territory would mean the end of Zelenskyy's career and possibly his life.
That's precisely what the trap that Russia is setting. All this talk about land swaps and land concessions could lead to I wouldn't want to say a violent overthrow of Zelenskyy, but definitely disturbances on the street. And coupled with the shortage of manpower in the battlefield and the fact that Ukraine just the other day relaxed the rules of young men from 18 to 23 to be able to leave Ukraine, says that, you know, a lot about how people are concerned about their own children. You know, more and more people are dying. Once again, Russia remains a predominant power in this war. And so there's a confluence of several factors that are making it very difficult for Zelenskyy as well going ahead.
Right. And that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to everyone for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.